the Honey War,
a bloodless conflict,
and an involuntary compromise.
The so-called Honey War was a conflict over the shared border of the state of Missouri and the Iowa Territory, nearly causing a minor civil war in the early 1800s. Because of a surveying mistake in 1816, there was a disagreement as to where the border was. Many of the citizens refused to cooperate with the Missouri government and rejected the idea of living in a state where slavery was legal. The bloodless conflict and forced compromise that followed impacted both states and the people living there, but remains mostly unknown.
In 1816, Colonel John C. Sullivan was appointed to survey and mark the border between Missouri and the Indian boundary line, as well as the northern border of Missouri. He left dirt mounds in the place of markers along the entirety of the border. As Sullivan surveyed, he made the mistake of using magnetic north as opposed to true north, causing the border to angle upward until it was 4 miles farther north on the eastern side than it was on the western side. When he described the location of his markers, he wrote that it was along a meridian line to the intersection of the parallel of latitude which passes through the rapids of the river Des Moines. This border was labeled the Sullivan Line.
The Missouri Compromise was published in 1820 due to a probable imbalance of pro-slavery and anti-slavery states in the government. The compromise asserted that every state below the southern boundary of Missouri, on the latitude of 36 degrees, would be admitted as a slave state, while every state above that boundary would be welcomed as a free state. One such clause accepted Missouri north of this line with the admittance of a free state. The compromise upset many people, yet it likely prevented a civil war for the next 30 years. After Missouri became a state, the government wanted to resurvey the northern border to be certain exactly where this compromise would be enforced.
In 1837, Joseph C. Brown was employed by the Missouri government to remark the border between Missouri and what was at the time the Wisconsin Territory. The dirt mounds left by Colonel Sullivan had deteriorated in 25 years of harsh weather, and Brown could only use Sullivan's written directions. When Sullivan had recorded the location of the border, he had made another error. He had referenced rapids in the Des Moines River, but there were none in the area he was surveying. The rapids he had been referencing were the Des Moines Rapids in the Mississippi River. The only rapids Brown could find in the Des Moines River were around 10 miles north of the original border. As a result, the border Brown had marked was between 9 and 13 miles north of Sullivan's original line. This border was called the Brown Line.
Iowa was part of the Wisconsin Territory at that time. The territory's government attempted to contact the federal government after the citizens began to disagree over the two boundaries. In the middle of this escalating conflict, the Iowa Territory separated itself from the Wisconsin Territory on June 12, 1838. After this new territory was created, a major dispute emerged along the border. Citizens believing they lived in Iowa had various concerns over residing in a place where slavery was legal. If the Missouri border had been moved north, the boundary of where slavery was legal would follow. This means slave owners from Missouri would also move north, and people living in the disputed territory would be surrounded by an institution many believed was immoral.
A 3-member commission was appointed to sort out the disagreement, with each state and the federal government sending one person. Of the 3, only 2 representatives arrived at the General Land Office. The governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, refused to send a surveyor to represent the state. Even without a 3rd member, the 2 surveyors still did not agree on a border. There were now 4 potential borders: the Sullivan Line, marked in 1816, the Brown Line, marked in 1837, the corrected Sullivan Line, and the line based on Sullivan's intended instructions.
A report written to the General Land Office by Albert Lee stated that the uncorrected Sullivan Line was the fairest of the 4 borders. Not long after this report was written, Missouri declared that the Brown Line was the official northern boundary of their state. Tax collectors were sent to collect from the 1,200 people living in the disputed land, around 2,500 acres at the northern border of Missouri. The people considered themselves Iowans, and because Iowa was a territory, they would not have to pay taxes. The citizens came together as a delegation to speak with Governor Robert Lucas about the unwarranted taxes.
Governor Lucas drafted a proclamation on July 29, 1839, requesting that the tax collectors from Missouri stop taxing the citizens, and officials in Iowa were also asked to maintain control of the area. In August of the same year, the governor of Missouri also issued a proclamation stating that the citizens living in the disputed area were in fact citizens of Missouri and therefore could be taxed as such. Iowa's government responded by asserting that the uncorrected Sullivan Line was the correct border, not the Brown Line, as Missouri claimed.
In 1839, an unidentified person cut down 3 honey trees.
The settlers had to rely on natural forms of sweetener. Sugar was a very pricey commodity because it had to be imported.
Because the trees were rare and hard to find, the loss of them heavily impacted the surrounding citizens. Who the perpetrator was is unknown, and neither state recognized the person as their citizen. While the event had little impact on the overall dispute, it gave the conflict its name, the Honey War. Some believe that Iowa did, in fact, find and arrest the culprit and charged him. Citizens of Missouri were outraged that the man was tried without jurisdiction, but there are no records of this ever occurring.
In October of the same year, a sheriff from Missouri, Uriah S. Gregory, went into the disputed area and once again tried to collect taxes from the citizens. As a result, he was swiftly arrested. Officials in Missouri assumed the sheriff was abducted, and Governor Boggs sent the Missouri State Militia to the border. A month after this incident, concerned with preventing violent conflict, the Iowa Legislative Assembly passed a resolution for the two governors to come to an agreement over the correct border. Governor Lucas vetoed the resolution, arguing that the federal government had to solve this dispute.
Governor Lucas was threatened by the arrival of Missouri's militia at the border, and in response charged General David Willick and General O.H. Allen with forming a militia for Iowa. Sources vary on the number of people in each military. However, it is agreed that Missouri's militia was bigger than Iowa's. According to witnesses, Iowa's militia could be described as ragtag and unorganized. The soldiers were not given weapons and were instead responsible for bringing their own. These homespun weapons included everything from the dasher of a butter churn to a sausage stuffer.
Most of the men in the two state militias were from other areas of their states and simply did not care about the border's location. Many joined for the money and clothing promised to them. This indifference led to poor morale, and there were many desertions. Missouri's militia did not have enough supplies for their soldiers, and many of the men robbed stores for supplies such as food and blankets. Many advocated for the governments to send their soldiers home.
A resolution was drafted on December 12, 1839, requesting to hand the dispute over to the federal government. This was written by an unknown source. Both states agreed to the resolution and disbanded their militias. The soldiers in the Missouri State Militia were bitter about being disbanded before any combat began. They took a piece of venison, cut it into 2 pieces, and named the pieces after each governor. They then took the venison and, quote, shot them both to bits, and held a funeral for the meat.
The federal government decided to take on the border dispute case. Governor Boggs of Missouri, however, refused to collaborate. Iowa was granted statehood on December 28, 1846. Congress suggested taking the altercation to the Supreme Court, and the case was brought to the court in 1847.
The Supreme Court delivered their opinion on April 6, 1849. It was decided that the original, uncorrected Sullivan Line was the true border between Missouri and Iowa. Joseph C. Brown and Henry B. Henderson found and remarked the border using cast iron pillars every 10 miles. On opposite sides of the pillars, the name of the state it faced was engraved. Brown died before the task was completed, and Robert W. Wells was chosen as his replacement.
In 1896, miles 40 through 60 of the border were reassessed, and new granite monuments replaced the cast iron markers. Most of the pillars are difficult to locate today, but satellite images and other new technologies make surveying much more manageable.
In 2005, the Missouri Department of Natural Resources Land Survey Program employed a company to once again resurvey the border. This time, it was to find the lost cast iron markers along the already established border. 13 of the 15 markers in the contracted area were recovered, and the other 2 had been previously moved.
The Honey War between Missouri and Iowa ended without the border location changing, but the dispute was still a remarkable event in the history of the two states. No lives were lost, but the feud caused tension. The line of slavery between the two states would be moved north, allowing slavery where it was previously outlawed.
On the surface, it seems as though the Honey War had little to no impact. However, this astounding event can set an example for the border disputes that are occurring today. The territorial and state governors of the time had little understanding of politics, yet they were able to work out a compromise without any bloodshed. If we learn from this success of the past, we should be able to solve the border disputes which plague us today around the world.